Well, we were debating about intricate issues about whether organisation should be an S with a Z, and if I'll take questions on that right now. If you, so thank you very much, David and Sandy, for the invitation. I've heard a lot of good things about the Summer Institute, and having been here, I can see why people say those good things. So thank you very much. I also want to thank Shannon for keeping me organised, which is no small achievement. So thank you for all your efforts in keeping things in order. So what I want to do in this paper is to examine the influence exerted on the thought of Friedrich Hayek by the work of Ludwig von Bertalanffy. Several distinguished commentators, you know all of them except possibly the last name there, Joachim Fuster, who's a very eminent neuroscientist who, along with Gerald Edelman, has said very nice things about Hayek's theoretical psychology. Several commentators have pointed out that Bertalanffy's ideas helped to shape Hayek's thinking from the late 1940s onwards, as he was developing his theoretical psychology and as he was developing his account of the market as a complex system. But insightful as those remarks are, I think, and I'm not going to dispute that they are correct, I think they are correct, what those authors don't do is explore in detail the nature and the significance of Bertalanffy's influence. So that's what I want to try and do in this paper. And just to give you a sense of where I'm going, so you can see the direction of travel, really my conclusions are twofold. I argue, first of all, that Bertalanffy's ideas helped Hayek to articulate and make explicit the relationship between mental and physical events, the relationship between mind and body that was implied by his theoretical psychology. And in particular, I think Bertalanffy's work afforded Hayek a set of concepts that enabled him to articulate that relationship as one involving what I think psychologists refer to as non-reductive physicalism or property dualism. And then the second main conclusion is that I think having acquired this set of concepts from Bertalanffy, Hayek then transfers it. He transfers some of those concepts from the realm of his analysis of the mind to his analysis of the economy. And he uses those insights to develop and express his emerging view of the economy as a complex system, in Bertalanffy's sense of that term system, one which displays structural or emergent properties, and one which evolves on the basis of those emergent properties. Now, I'm not meaning to claim that Hayek's ideas about the economy as a complex adaptive system are wholly attributable to Bertalanffy. We all know that there are plenty of other influences. But what I want to focus on today is the contribution that Bertalanffy, I think, makes to the development of Hayek's ideas. I don't know how much you know about Bertalanffy, so I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about who he is and what he thought. And I hope by the end of it you'll agree he's quite an intriguing character. He was born in Vienna in 1901, and he attended the University of Vienna, where he was a student of Moritz Schlick. He attended some of the meetings of the Vienna Circle. And over the course of his career, he worked as a theoretical and as an applied biologist in a variety of different universities and institutes in a variety of different countries. His was a rather peripatetic existence, partly because of misfortune, the war and so on, partly, I think, if you read between the lines, or even if you just read the lines of some of the biographies of Bertalanffy, he comes over as a man whose estimation of his own abilities and remuneration, for example, didn't always tally precisely with the estimation of the other folk who were doing the employing. He did achieve widespread recognition, I think, for his work on the comparative physiology of metabolism and growth. He developed a practical method for the diagnosis of cancerous cells, and he got recognition for that, as well as for the work that I'm going to be talking about today, which is his work in the philosophy of biology. And he was, according to his biographer, nominated for the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1972, but passed away before any decision could be made about that. So where do we begin? Well, we begin where Bertalanffy began, writing in the mid-1920s. And at that time, biology was in the midst of the so-called mechanism, vitalism controversy. Mechanism, as you probably know, presupposes that the world is atomistic, consisting of nothing more than the sum of its individual material parts. And to use a phrase that was commonly employed at the time, and which will turn out to have some moderate significance later on in my talk, mechanists thought that the world consisted of a mosaic of separate atomistic independent parts. So on this view, biology would ultimately become no more than a branch of physics. Explanations of biological phenomena would simply be couched in terms of the behavior of isolated elementary physical particles. And it won't come as any surprise to learn that Bertalanffy felt that this was a problematic approach. It was problematic, he felt, because it ignored the way that the behavior of the individual parts is affected by the relations into which they stand with other physical parts. So it fails to do justice to the importance of those relations for the properties and the behavior of biological organisms, because that's what he's focusing upon first of all. Now, the advocates of vitalism, on the other hand, argued, contrary to the mechanists, that far from being explicable in terms of isolated physical particles, if you were going to understand biological phenomena, you had to postulate the existence of some supernatural force existing independently of the material world, something that gave life to the biological world. And we can think here of Bergson's Elan Vital, we can think of, and anyone who's German here, forgive me for this pronunciation, Hans Driesch's notion of Entelechy. These are the people who were advocating vitalist approaches at the time. And again, Bertalanffy thought that there were profound shortcomings to this approach. He felt that vitalism effectively meant nothing less than a renunciation of a scientific explanation of biological phenomena. So what he sought to do, what Bertalanffy sought to do, was develop what he called an organismic conception of the biological world. And this conception, he believed, would enable him to transcend the opposition between mechanism and vitalism and thereby overcome the shortcomings of both approaches. And this organismic approach, Bertalanffy said, would really make it possible to do two things. It'd make it possible to do justice to the importance of the structural relations that exist between the parts of an organism that make it an organism. But nevertheless, it would still be possible to do science. You could do a scientific but non-reductionist analysis of biological phenomena. Now, how did Bertalanffy think that he could do that? Well, he thought that the way to develop this new approach was by means of these four concepts. And I'll briefly go through them because it will help us to fix the meaning of certain terms that will be useful in helping us understand Bertalanffy's influence on Hayek in due course. So what do we mean by a system? A system is a set of elements that are related to one another in a particular way. In Bertalanffy's terms, there are complex of elements in mutual interaction, and we'll see that definition recur later in some of Hayek's theoretical psychology. So the set of relations that characterizes a particular kind of system is its structure. We can think of water as a very, very simple example of a system. There are elements, hydrogen and oxygen atoms. They are interrelated in a particular way, and they form the structure of a water molecule. Now, Bertalanffy in this context also uses the notion of organization. Any Austrians in the audience? Don't panic. This is a different sense of the term organization. Stay calm. It's okay. So the term organization is the term that Bertalanffy uses simply to denote how individual parts have to stand in certain relations to one another. They have to form a particular structure if a certain kind of system is to obtain. Notice there's nothing in that definition that implies that the organization has to arise in a particular way, through conscious design, for example. And I'll return to that point in a moment or two. Now, as I've already mentioned, Bertalanffy believed that when individual elements are organized into structures or systems of the kind that I've mentioned, they behave differently to the way they behave when they're in isolation. And that has an important implication for Bertalanffy, because it implies that, taken as a whole, systems have properties that are quite different from the properties of the individual parts or elements taken in isolation. And following the terminology of the famous zoologist and psychologist Conway Lloyd Morgan, Bertalanffy refers to these novel system-level properties as emergent properties. So water molecules, of course, if they're structured in the right way, they possess properties like liquidity that aren't possessed by the individual hydrogen and oxygen atoms taken in isolation. Now, the notion of emergence, and this brings us to the final one of our four concepts that are so important for Bertalanffy. The notion of emergence suggests for Bertalanffy that the world is hierarchical. It consists of a hierarchy, a nested hierarchy of systems. The world is stratified, Bertalanffy thinks, in the sense that there's a hierarchy of ontologically distinct systems, a hierarchy of levels or hierarchical order, as Bertalanffy terms it, each of which has its own distinctive properties. So molecules have different properties to the atoms of which they're composed. Cells have different properties to the molecules, which are their constituent parts. Organs have different properties to cells, and so on and so forth. And you can see this later in Hayek as well, where he says, and I think it's in Notes on the Evolution of Systems of Rules of Conduct, Hayek says that one of the distinctive features of the economy is that it is a complex system whose parts are themselves complex systems. So that is a manifestation in Hayek of this kind of hierarchical ontology. A couple of other brief observations. What this means, Bertalanffy thinks of himself as someone who was opposed to reductionism. He thinks there are distinct higher level biological laws that describe the behavior of emergent biological systems, and they can't be reduced without loss of understanding to the lower level laws of physics. And then finally, in case there were any Austrians who were desperately worried, Bertalanffy thinks that the relational organization of the elements that characterizes these systems is something that arises spontaneously. He actually uses the term spontaneous order in his 1952 book, one that's cited by Hayek. He says that organized wholes like organisms are examples of spontaneous order, whereby the biological process as a whole carries order within itself. So relational organization is something which is the product of a process of evolution. It arises spontaneously. It's not consciously designed. And that's one of the things he thinks differentiates his approach from that of the Vitalists, where you have to have that overarching, organizing, immaterial force. So just to sum up this brief account of Bertalanffy, what his ultimate goal turned out to be, and this is probably, those of you who know him, this is what you know him for, his ultimate goal was to develop what he termed general system theory. In other words, he thought he could use the concepts that I've outlined, the notions of system, organization, the notion of a level, the notion of emergence. He thought he could use those to develop a transdisciplinary framework, one that could deal with phenomena of organized complexity at any level, whether it be physical, biological, individual, psychological, or social. This is what he termed general system theory, and that was a notion, a term that he first introduced at a Chicago seminar in 1937. So that's a brief overview of Bertalanffy, and I hope it helps to make what follows a little bit clearer. Actually, yeah, we'll put that up in a second or two. What I want to consider, first of all, when it comes to the influence on Hayek, is the influence that Bertalanffy exerted, if you like, on Hayek's theoretical psychology. And normally when I give this talk, I give it to an audience full of Austrians, and you all know what's involved in his book on theoretical psychology, the sensory order. And I guess that probably... How many of you know the sensory order, just as a matter of interest? How many don't? Sorry, how many don't? Okay, for the benefit of those of you who aren't so sure, I'll give a potted two-sentence history, which will induce hilarity in those of you who know the book. Because the idea of giving a two-sentence summary of it is somewhat implausible. Hayek views the mind as a structure of neurons, and he thinks of it as a rule-governed classificatory system. And it's a rule-governed classificatory system which takes external stimuli and classifies them, and thereby, for Hayek, creates the sensory world, the sensory qualities that we perceive. And in particular, according to Hayek, external stimuli are classified as the same or different, and they therefore give rise to the same or different sensory qualities, depending on whether they give rise to the same or different ongoing pattern of neuronal firings in the brain. In other words, external stimuli are classified as the same or different according to whether they give rise to the same or different followings, as Hayek terms it, whereby a following I mean the ongoing pattern of neuronal firings in the brain. Still pretty darn good, though, I reckon. You're a harsh judge, Shield, you know that? This really shouldn't be recorded, you know that? I'm not going to sign that form, just no way. The other thing that's worth knowing about the sensory order by way of context is it started life as a 1920 student paper. Hayek was working in a laboratory of experimental psychology in, I think, Vienna. Could have been somewhere else. Sorry? Zurich, okay, in the 1920s. And he wrote a paper entitled, I'm not going to try and say the German, Contribution to a Theory of How Consciousness Develops in 1920. He put it aside in 1920 and returns to it in 1945. And this is where Bertalanffy's influence begins to come in. And actually, I think we can pin down Bertalanffy's influence even more precisely than that. And that's what I'll try and do now. And it's to do with these paragraphs. So what Hayek's talking about here is the nature of the relationship between mental and physical events to which his theoretical psychology gives rise. And the punchline, and I'll say it now, is that there's a footnote at the end of this which quotes the work of Bertalanffy and his colleague and friend, Joseph Woodger, an English biologist and philosopher of biology. And what's Hayek talking about here? Well, what he's doing here is elaborating on how the relationship between mental and physical events can be understood by alluding to the notion of structural or emergent properties. So Hayek distinguishes here between the physical properties of neural events. They are the ones that neural events have in isolation. Is there a clicker here? Ah, clicker, yes. They have in isolation. Super. They're the physical properties of neural events. And Hayek distinguishes those physical properties from the mental properties of neural events, such as their capacity to give rise to certain kinds of sensory experience. And the mental properties of neural events, Hayek tells us, arise when neural events and neurons form part of a particular structure. Neural events are those that arise as a result, mental properties I should say, are those that arise as a result of neural events that happen as part of an order of interconnected neural events. This is the point that I made earlier. What Hayek's arguing here is it's only because people's nerve fibers are organized into a particular kind of structure which means that some stimuli give rise to different followings. It's only because of that discrimination between stimuli, classification, and therefore sense perception is possible. So as Hayek puts it, the mental properties of neural events are those which they possess only as part of the particular structure we call mind. Now in the second part of the quote that's up there, we have Hayek discussing in more detail the nature of these mental properties and their relations to physical or neural events. And he says, all that theoretical biology has in this respect to say on the significance of structural properties as distinct from the properties of the elements, that's emergence, and about the significance of organization is directly applicable to our problem. Note the use of Bertalanffy's concepts. So the significance of this appeal to the notion of structural properties and to organization is, of course, that it indicates that for Hayek, mental properties are emergent properties. They arise only when people's neurons are organized into a structure of the kind that I just described. And this is why Hayek remarks, also in the passage, he says, and he's echoing a phrase from Bertalanffy's work here, he says, the mental order does not arise from the parts being thrown together into a heap. Of course, an order does not arise from the parts being thrown together into a heap. An order involves elements plus certain relations between them. So Hayek, as I say here, is saying that the mental properties are emergent properties of the structured array of neurons in our minds. And he's using Bertalanffy's work in order to articulate what he means. And this is why I believe that. The 4 paragraphs that I've mentioned were not present in the first draft that Hayek produced when he returned to the sensory order and decided to rework his 1920 student manuscript. There's a manuscript that was produced by Hayek in 1945 called What is Mind? And you can compare that, of course, with the final version of the sensory order. And what we see is that the 4 paragraphs that I was just drawing your attention to didn't exist in the 45 version. They were introduced by 1952. And what's also telling is that we know that correspondence suggests that Bertalanffy was sent Hayek's manuscript in about April 1950, and he returned comments to Hayek in June 1950. I don't know this for sure, but I think the men met in 1947. They were both in Altbach in the Austrian Tyrol in August and early September 1947. And the first letter that I can find in the archives from one to the other is dated, I think it's November 1947. So my conjecture is that the men met in Altbach in the summer of 1947, struck up a correspondence, and the correspondence led to Hayek sending Bertalanffy the manuscript of the sensory order. As I've already said, in a footnote at the end of the paragraphs, Hayek cites Bertalanffy's work, and there are other references to other works by Bertalanffy in the bibliography to the sensory order. So I think it's clear that that Hayek was reading Bertalanffy's work, and that the addition of the paragraphs that we've been looking at is attributable to Bertalanffy.
Is there no evidence they knew each other in Vienna?
None that I've come across. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, it does mean that I don't know about it. It's a good question, though.
They were just 2 years apart of each other. I was born 2 years earlier, and they were both at the University of Vienna, studying psychology.
Fringe members of the Vienna.
I'm thinking there's a job for somebody to go and try and track down some evidence. There you go, gentlemen.
There you go.
Or ladies, if ladies in the audience want to do it. Why does this matter? Well, I think what this means is that the significance of this, if you like, is that Hayek is portraying mental phenomena not as consisting of some kind of distinctive mental stuff that exists independently of the physical and biological world. He's saying that mental phenomena are an emergent property. And I think this is an example of, as I mentioned earlier, a non-reductive materialist or property dualist theory of the mind. It's materialist in the sense that it portrays the brain as consisting ultimately of nothing more than physical matter, but it's nevertheless non-reductive because it suggests that the structured interaction between that physical matter gives rise to emergent mental properties. I try and cash that out a little bit by using it to help me understand a passage that I certainly found puzzling when I first came across it. This is a passage that comes towards the end of the sensory order, where Hayek is drawing out some of the implications of his theory of mind for various philosophical issues. And these are paragraphs that, again, that weren't there in the 1945 manuscript. They were added between 45 and 1952. And it's something that Hayek is discussing here, the topics of dualism and materialism in the philosophy of mind. And you'll be happy to know that I won't go through all the paragraphs that are in the paper. But I'll just refer to this one here. It's 8.40. And when I first read it, I was mightily puzzled. He says that because the account of the determination of mental qualities which has been given here explains them by the operation of material world processes, physical processes, it's likely to be described as materialistic. And he says that doesn't matter very much, except for the fact that people have got the wrong end of the stick when it comes to materialism. It gives rise to erroneous ideas which prejudice people against a theory of the kind that Hayek is describing. And then there's this intriguing bit at the end of this paragraph where he says, in the true sense of the word materialistic, it might even be argued that our theory is less materialistic than the dualistic theories which postulate a distinct mind substance. And I'm not a philosopher, but I was puzzled by this. I didn't get that. But I think you can understand it when you read it against the background provided by Bertalanffy's work. And I'll just explain what I mean by that. The problem that bedevils both mechanism and vitalism, according to Bertalanffy, there's a problem that bedevils both of them. They're not so opposed as you might think in the end. And that's that both approaches view the material world as being essentially atomistic in nature. On this view, in other words, physical matter, physical particles only enter into external relations with one another. In other words, their properties remain unchanged by the relations in which they get involved. Now, the possibility that physical particles might actually enter into internal relations with each other and thereby form organized structures, like the human brain, that's ruled out of court, not just by mechanism, but also because it shares the same atomistic ontology by vitalism as well. And curiously enough, this insight isn't original to me. I very much like the work of the historian of biology, Donna Haraway, who's written a beautiful book. I think it was a PhD thesis. It's in it's on the history of organicist biology, amongst other things. And she writes as follows, and I think, although she's not writing about Bertalanffy, the sentence that I'm about to read applies just as well to him. People like Bertalanffy saw vitalism as part of the mechanistic paradigm rather than opposed to it ultimately, because both were limited by the same images and the same root metaphors, in particular by their atomistic worldview. So if you view the passage that I showed you earlier against the background of what I've just said, then I think it makes more sense. When Hayek says that in the true sense of the word materialistic, I love the analogy or the parallel between true individualism and true materialism. What he's arguing is that in what you might term, in the true sense of the word materialistic, when he says that our theory is less materialistic than the dualistic theories which postulate a distinct mind substance, what Hayek's point really is that true materialism is not the same as atomism. True materialism allows for physical particles to enter into ordered structures and give rise to emergent properties. So by acknowledging the possibility that particles can enter into ordered structures that exhibit emergent mental properties, you can acknowledge that there's more to mind than mere physical stuff without having to postulate a distinct mental substance. And this approach is less materialistic than that adopted by mechanism and vitalism, precisely because it avoids the atomistic picture of the world presupposed by those perspectives, a worldview whose shortcomings drove the vitalists as an act of last resort into postulating some woolly mind substance. Anyway, that's what I think is the payoff, if you like, to this interpretation. It helps me, at least, understand some passages in Hayek about which I had not the foggiest before. Moving on, and this is the segue to the second part of the paper, where I begin to try and explore how Hayek's ideas don't affect his theoretical psychology, but rather are used to help him develop and express his own emerging ideas about the economy as an evolving complex system. Now, I alluded to this point earlier. Hayek only mentions Bertalanffy's notion of a system once in the sensory order, but he does deploy it in another one of his still currently unpublished papers on theoretical psychology, one on which he was working in the early 1950s. The paper is entitled Within Systems and About Systems, and it is Hayek's ultimately not terribly successful attempt to try and understand how two systems of the kind that he analysed in the sensory order might communicate with each other. I say it's not currently out. It is about to come out in the next volume of Hayek's collected works, along with the sensory order and along with the 1920 student paper. So, as we can see, Hayek says that I'm using the term system in the sense in which Bertalanffy uses it, in the sense of a coherent structure of causally connected physical parts. There are other places in the 50s as well where Hayek refers to Bertalanffy's work. In Degrees of Explanation, he says that general system theory is one of the intellectual developments that he's drawing on in his emerging explorations of complex phenomena. But it's really, I think, only in the 1960s that he begins to put these ideas to serious work, in the ideas of Bertalanffy, that is, to serious work in developing his economics. The first thing I want to talk about concerns a letter that Hayek wrote to Karl Popper in 1960. And he said there that he's trying to restate his views on economic theory using the conception of higher level regularities. Draws on Bertalanffy. And he says, yeah, I suspect that this is really what Bertalanffy with his general system theory was all about. And Hayek writes and delivers at Virginia in 1961 a series of lectures entitled A New Look at Economic Theory, and they hadn't been published until, I think, last year, when they came out in the Market and Other Orders, the volume of the collected works just prior to Sandy's Mill volume. And in those lectures, there is a section entitled Higher Level Regularities, and Hayek discusses there how those regularities describe the general character of an order. In particular, the fact that in such an order they'll obtain certain relations between the parts. But he doesn't really make very much of it. There's a section, but it doesn't really do very much interesting intellectual work, frankly. I don't think so. Where things get exciting, at least for me, is in one of my favourite Hayek essays, and I suspect it isn't many people's, probably reflects how weird I am. But I think there's a brilliant essay in 1967 called Notes on the Evolution of Systems of Rules of Conduct. And if you like Hayek and haven't read it, I really encourage you to go read it, because it's terrific. And it's there, I think, that Hayek employs Bertalanffy's notion of a system and his distinction between different levels of reality and puts it to good effect. And in particular, what he starts doing in that essay is he gives an account of the coordinated power of the market, something that in that essay he terms the overall order of actions. And he describes how that coordinated power of the market, or the overall order of actions, is an emergent property. But this time it's an emergent property of an economic system, where the system is formed through the structured interaction of people who are adhering to certain systems of formal and informal rules. And you all know what those rules are: tort law, contract law, property law, and informal norms of promise-keeping and honesty. And you can see that Hayek thinks that it's an emergent property. He says the overall order of actions in a group is more than the totality of the irregularities observable in the actions of individuals. It cannot be reduced to them. It's more than the mere sum of its parts. And he goes on to say, some regularity in the behavior of the elements produces a wholly different higher order, higher level regularity is, I would put it, in the actions of the whole. And again, it can't be reduced to the regularities, the lower level regularities of the individual human parts. I think this is another telling quote. The emergent property, the overall order of actions that I've just described, I think really is generated by a system of rules, where the term system is being used in Bertalanffy's sense of that term. In other words, for Hayek, the emergent property, the overall order of actions, is generated by the causal interaction of several different rules, rather than being simply the sum of the separate effects of each of those individual rules taken in isolation. And I think you can see that most clearly in the quote that's up here. Hayek says, and we'll come back to the point about evolution in a moment, he says the evolutionary selection of different rules of individual conduct operates through the viability of the order it will produce. And any given rules of individual conduct may prove beneficial. In other words, they may make a positive contribution to the generation of the coordinated power of the market as part of one set of rules. But he also says they may prove to be harmful. In other words, they may make a negative contribution to the generation of the emergent property, the overall order of actions, as part of another set of rules. Now, we'll come back to the point about evolution in a moment, but the point that I want to make here is that you'll remember that Bertalanffy says that the elements of a system behave differently. They have a different causal impact in that system compared to when they're in isolation. And that's what gives rise to emergent system-level properties. Well, I think Hayek is making an analogous argument here. He's saying that the rules in terms of which social systems are defined have a different impact on social outcomes depending on the other sets of rules with which they interact. And I think it's that insight, the insight that the outcomes to which complementary sets of rules give rise are emergent rather than additive. I think it's that insight that Hayek's trying to capture by using Bertalanffy's notion of system. And you can see this elsewhere, I think, if you read Law, Legislation and Liberty, especially where Hayek is talking about justice. Think of the rules of judges. The role of a judge on that account is to find new rules that are complementary to existing rules, and by complementary, I think, they form part of the same system in the sense that they give rise to the overall order of actions that serves to coordinate people's plans. The other thing that's worth noting just briefly in this context, you'll remember at the start, or quite early on, I said that one of the terms that was used to describe a mechanistic worldview was that people said that it constituted a mosaic of independent parts, that term mosaic. Hayek uses that term in the sensory order to contrast his approach with the approach adopted by the associationist psychologists who adopted an atomistic worldview. And then, lo and behold, sometime later, but I don't think this is a trivial point, if you look at the third volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty, when Hayek is talking about systems of rules and the implications of his view of the economy as a rule-governed system for policy, he says the following. The idea that we're not fully free to pick and choose whatever combination of features we want our society to possess, or to fit them together into a viable whole. He's talking about that, and he says, we cannot build a desirable order like a mosaic, simply by selecting whatever parts we like best. So the point is that Hayek, even there, is using the same terminology that he came across 30 years earlier. He's saying that, he's underlining there his commitment to the view that the rules that he thinks should govern society really do form a system. And he's contrasting his organic system-based approach to approaches which view the economy as a mosaic, or an atomistic or an additive worldview, which says you can simply pick and choose whatever rules that you want. I said we'd come back to the point about evolution. And here it is. The notion of systems of rules, each of which give rise to this higher level emergent property, I think that turns out also to be significant for Hayek's attempt to deal with the next task that he sets himself. And that's the task of explaining how the relevant systems of rules, the ones that give rise to the coordinative power of the market, how do they actually come to prevail? And this is Hayek's famous, infamous, notorious theory of cultural evolution or group selection. And the key point to note here is that the trait that forms the basis for the competition between the groups is itself the emergent property, the emergent order of actions to which each system gives rise. He says here, what may be called the natural selection of rules will operate on the basis of the greater or lesser efficiency of the resulting order of the group. That's the emergent property. It's the resulting overall order of actions, not the regularity of the actions of the separate individuals, which is important for the preservation of the group. This, of course, is not original to me. I get this from the superb and excellent Jerry Gauss, once of this parish, I believe. Where I think I can add something is saying a little bit about where Hayek gets this idea. We need to turn here to look at another essay that Hayek published in 1967, The Results of Human Action but Not of Human Design. And in the course of that essay, Hayek says that a key insight in the history of social theory, one that he attributes to Karl Menger, was the realization that the problem of the origin or formation and that of the manner of functioning of social institutions is essentially the same. And if you look at the text where that claim comes, there's a footnote. And the footnote is to my good friend Bertalanffy, and it reads the following. Well, it reads what it says there. Why is that significant? Well, that passage from Bertalanffy is to be found in a particular section of his 1952 book, Problems of Life. And what Bertalanffy is arguing there is that the static study of the functions served by certain biological systems within an organism cannot be divorced from the dynamic processual account of how those organized systems arise and maintain themselves. Now that, of course, is exactly analogous to what Hayek is arguing, to Hayek's point about Menger's insight. Hayek wants to argue that the static functional account of how certain systems of social rules underwrite the emergent power of the market to coordinate people's plans, that has to be inextricably bound up with the dynamic account of the process through which those systems of rules emerge over time. I'll be done in 5 minutes, don't worry. So what I think this goes to show in the first instance is that Hayek was drawing on Bertalanffy in support of his Mengerian claim that you can't decouple the static and dynamic aspects of the analysis of order. You've got to combine them if the possibility of market order really is to be thoroughly understood. It's not for nothing, it's not a trivial aside that Hayek refers on many occasions to the importance of, as he puts it, the twin notions of evolution and spontaneous order. So on Hayek's account, those two concepts are intimately bound up because, as we've seen, it's only, according to him, it's only through an evolutionary account of the development of those systems of rules which sustain the emergent capacity to coordinate people's actions. It's only through that that you can obtain an ultimately satisfactory account of how the spontaneous order of the market is possible. But I think Bertalanffy's contribution is a bit more than that. It's a little bit more than simply providing an illustration of how natural scientists engage in a form of theorizing analogous to that proposed by Menger and Hayek. Because I think some of the key, not all, but some of the key components of the analytical framework, in terms of which Hayek tries to articulate and develop his Mengerian insight about the need to combine static and dynamic analyses, the conceptual glue, if you like, that holds the twin notions of evolution and spontaneous order together, I think some of the concepts that form that conceptual glue come from Bertalanffy. In particular, the notion of a system and also the notion of emergent properties. Because it's the emergent properties that are the trait upon which the selective process operates, and it's the system of rules that gives rise to that emergent property. I'm not saying it's all in Hayek. He clearly gets the idea of focusing on groups from somebody else. Sewell Wright, Wynne Edwards, Carl Saunders. There are others who deserve a significant role in this story. So don't let me think I'm attributing it all to Bertalanffy, because I'm certainly not. But I think that Bertalanffy does make an important contribution. And it's not simply a contribution that involves him enabling Hayek to find another way of saying something that he was already saying. I think it pushes forward Hayek's analysis a little bit as well, or enables Hayek to push forward his analysis. So here's where I'll draw to a close. I think, as those of us who know Hayek's work are well aware, he spends a lot of time reminding the reader that the development of evolutionary biology was informed by the ideas of the early political economists. But I think what we can see here is Hayek reappropriating for economics the ideas from biology, but they've been refracted by the biologists. The ideas aren't the same ones that the biologists took from the early political economists. They've been tweaked and changed a little bit. And Hayek's reappropriating some of those ideas, in particular the notions of system and emergence, and he's reappropriating them for economics, and he's using them to try and frame and develop and express his emerging understanding of the economy as a complex system. And I'll end with this quote. It was said yesterday, and I wouldn't deny it, that one needs to be careful about placing a good deal of evidence on the retrospective thoughts of authors about why they wrote what they wrote. But anyway, this is what Hayek writes in Law, Legislation, and Liberty. My colleagues in the social sciences find my study on the sensory order uninteresting or indigestible. I think that's actually true. My experience is that people find it uninteresting and indigestible. I think they're wrong, but many of them do. But here's the key thing. The work in it helped me greatly to clear my mind on much that is very relevant to social theory. My conception of evolution, of a spontaneous order, and of the methods and limits of our endeavours to explain complex phenomena have been formed largely in the course of that book. Well, what I hope to have done today is to persuade you that that isn't a completely false claim. He's not completely rewriting his own history. I think that the ideas that he came across through Bertalanffy didn't just summarize what he was already doing, but helped him to advance his own analysis in particular of the economy as a complex system. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention, for listening.
Not sure now where to start.
I'm kind of interested in the 1920s paper, the 1945 paper, and then sensory order. Is there any evidence that the 1945 What is Mind manuscript had any influence by its economics? Right, so is the student paper and this 1945 What is Mind paper, are they the same? Are they substantively different? Is there any, and if they're different, is there any evidence that the knowledge papers in economics had any bearing on the psychology?
I have been through some of it line by line, not all of it. So what I say is hedged with caveats. But I think that the key idea, what are for me the key ideas that Hayek uses to answer the question that he poses in the sensory order, Namely, why is it the case that the classification of events provided by the natural sciences is different from the classification that we experience in the sensory order? The key ideas of the theoretical framework that he uses to answer that question, the idea that individual nerve firings are physically the same, the idea that in order to understand how classification happens, you don't look at differences in individual nerve firings, you look at the patterns of nerve firings that arise in a structured array of neurons. Things like that are, I think, largely the same between the two. That's my instinct. I wouldn't bet my life on it, but that's what I think is the case. What I think Hayek... There are things that he adds. I mean, one of the things he's on record as saying, and there's a super paper by a chap called De Vecchio in History of Political Economy in 2003 where he traces this out. Hayek says that I knew I had a really good theory in 1920, but when I returned to the paper, he says something like, I wasn't sure of the problem that I was addressing. I thought I had a solution, but I couldn't explain how my theoretical framework articulated with the problem that I was trying to address. And I think one of the things that gets added between 1920 and 1945, and De Vecchio attributes this to Hayek's reading of the Gestalt psychologists, is that they provided him with a definition of mind and body, a definition of mental and physical events that enabled him to bring his theory to bear in a way that he thought fruitful on the mind-body problem. I don't mean to claim he solved it, but he thought he found a way of bringing the theory to bear on it. Now, I don't want to go on too long, so I hope that helps a bit, Ted.
So I was just going to say, I think that's a great question, Ted, and I don't really have an answer to that specific question, but I do think that you can't understand Hayek on methodology and epistemology without looking at 1920, 1945, and 1952. I think that I actually have a paper on this in JHED a couple of months ago. Those papers together explain why Hayek cannot be counted as a Misesian a priorist.
Thank you for this wonderful, wonderful talk. I was reminded that many years ago I gave lectures, thanks to Sandy and David, on Hayek. And the third lecture was on the sensory order. And not surprisingly, I have not written them up. So
You should. You should.
So I went, and then I remember Buchanan attended the sensory order, and I only analyzed, I did a textual exegesis of the preface.
Okay.
And the preface is fascinating from all kinds of points of view. But rather than that, there is one passage which I would like to read to you. I hope you have not already read it, because
I may have read it, but probably haven't understood it.
But so this, so I just, if I may read, I want. Okay, so I want to. I'm scared of Sandy. So, so the reason I'm reading it is because I'll have a sharp question. I will see how it ties into Bayesianism. And I want to ask Paul whether this passage could be read through Bayesianism and through the earlier talk on Harsanyi and common prior and things like this. So that's why I'm indulging. I'm not indulging myself. So this increasing ramification of, I'm quoting Hayek, this increasing ramification of every chain of impulses as it ascends through successive relays to higher levels.
Yeah.
Will mean that at any moment the general excitatory state of the whole nervous system will depend less and less on the new stimuli being currently received and more on the continued course of chains of impulses set up by stimuli which were received by some period in the past. So this is this temporal
the model
distinction.
metaphor, the model map distinction.
So now the crucial sentence is the following, and this is the Bayesian convergence point of view. In consequence, an ever-increasing part of the forces determining the response will depend on the pre-existing distribution of impulses throughout the whole system of connected fibers, while the newly arriving impulses will play a corresponding. So to the extent that there are different generations, and they are all talking about the same subject, say mathematical economics, there is going to be a difference in the distribution of how the priors were done before and how the priors are after. So inevitably there is going to be a difference in subjective probabilities. And so inevitably there will be no consequent consensus. And so this business, if you like, the talk was on Rawls versus Knight, but if you can come down and make it between Harsanyi and Aumann, I think the problem lies here. And I think he has put his finger on it through the biological metaphor.
Do you want me to respond to that, if I can? No, I mean, I think I can have a crack at responding to it if you want.
Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So a couple of observations. One, maybe three observations at least. I mean, one thing I think that you're alluding to is the way that what Bruce Caldwell terms Hayek's scientific subjectivism. One implication of what you've said is the following. Identical external stimuli will produce different responses from the individual person, because although the external stimuli may be different people, well, they'll have two different things. They will have a subtly different neuronal structure in their bodies, brains, and they will also have different patterns of impulses passing through that neuronal structure at any particular point in time. And because of those two differences, it means that they will interpret and respond to, differently, ostensibly identical external stimuli. Is that a fair rendering of at least part of what you've said?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I think one thing that Hayek gets out of this is that if people have different neuronal structures, different patterns of ongoing nerve firings going on, they will interpret the world differently. This is an argument for dispersed knowledge. Point one. None of this is original to me. This is in Bruce and no doubt others, and if I'm mangling it, it's my fault, not his. Ted may have something to say on this, because
This is Hayek's scientific postmodernism.
there is an interesting debate to which I commend you all between Messrs. Burzak and Caldwell in economics and philosophy in dates.
1994?
Now you know where to go look. It's great. Read it. That would be one point. You know, I'll try and take up your point about Bayesianism just briefly. And forgive me if I mangle this, okay? Hayek has this argument that he tries to link to Gödel, that the brain is a system, because it's a classificatory apparatus, it can only completely comprehend objects that are an order of magnitude less complex than itself. So we can never fully understand ourselves. In an enormous leap that defies logic, I suspect. I would like to say that this means that we appear to be able to act creatively as human beings. Now, what that means for me is that if people can act creatively, then that means that one might be skeptical about the grand state space assumption that I believe underpins things like savage and expected utility. And if I understand things correctly, then Bayesian updating doesn't get you out of it. Because if you can't, if something is a genuine surprise, it can't be in your priors, so you can't update it from those priors. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Splendid. Thank you.
But isn't there also the problem that on a Hayek, it would be a weird sort of Bayesianism to try to assimilate Hayek to, merely on the grounds that so much of what's going on is going to be tacit, and so you're not going to be able to really access your priors very well, and...
That's kind of my point, yeah, as well.
Okay, right.
Except you put it better than I did.
Ted, did you have a short? Okay, Rob.
It's a fantastic piece of work, Paul. I just have one quick thing and then a comment. Am I assuming correctly that we know that Hayek was not present at the 1937 General Systems meeting?
I would have been assuming that.
Yeah.
One of the frustrating things, I think, is that so you finish and then I'll...
So, well, okay, so this is, I know this is outside the scope of your paper, but the 1920 paper intrigues me because of the Zurich location and because my sense is that the they had their own general systems theory in the air in those days by virtue of Saussurian structural linguistics and Walrasian general equilibrium theory, which are structurally isomorphic to one another, but that were, I think, part of the intellectual common sense of 1920. And Hayek, when Hayek writes, like in 1943, about the facts of the social sciences and talks about their relational quality, it makes me think along the lines of your paper about the physical-mental relationship between the physical words and the mental meanings that language, how Saussurian language works, or how physical goods and relative prices in a Walrasian structure are also related in an emergent fashion. And so I wonder if Hayek, grabbed onto that and then came back to it later, as you suggest, under the influence of Gestalt psychology and sort of had a rebirth of that inchoate thought from earlier, and suddenly now had a richer structure in which to develop that.
There are bits in the sensory order where Hayek says that, and I hope others who know the book well will help me out pinning down the exact terms and sections, pages. There are parts where he says that ultimately the web of interconnected neurons and concepts will almost sort of become whole, and you will end up defining concepts simply in terms of their relations with other concepts, which I'm thinking is related to Saussurianism, but I would have to know more about that to be sure. Hayek's is clearly a relational theory of mind, and one of the things I think is nice about the story that I've told, although I would say that, wouldn't I, is that Hayek's theory of mind is one which I think sets great store by metaphor, by the transfer of concepts from one domain in which they're customarily used to another domain with which they previously haven't been associated. And you can think of that in terms of Hayek's theory of mind by the forging of new connections between different sets of neurons. And there's a tantalizing bit in I think it's the primacy of the abstract. Yeah, it's the primacy of the abstract, because that was given, as you know, at a symposium in Outback where Arthur Koestler, that was organized by Arthur Koestler. And Koestler has a theory of metaphor. And in the discussions, Hayek says, well, I think this is quite close. The account that I set out here is quite close to Koestler's account of, I think it's bisociation, which is the name that I think is given to Koestler's account of metaphor. And what I like about this story is that what Hayek's doing on this account is quite consistent with his theoretical psychology, because he's getting this idea from Bertalanffy in the theoretical psychology, the notion of a system, emergent properties, and so on. And he's transferring it metaphorically to an attempt to understand the economy. And I think that's an example of metaphor that Hayek that is quite consistent with his own theoretical psychology.
Sure. On Saussurian linguistics, so if you go to this distinction between parole and langue, or between the synchronous to diachronous,
yep.
And then you go to Hayek's cousin,
Ludwig.
When Ludwig says a word has no meaning except when it is placed in a context. By itself it means nothing.
Yeah.
And so this the question is, what is the context? Those are all the things which, all those external stimuli which have been absorbed and put up. So it is of direct relevance to reading a text, to interpretation, to reading an economy, and so on. So it's very nicely connected.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say, as far as I know, there are no references to Saussure in Hayek's work, but there are several references to Peirce.
Yeah.
We can get to it.
Sure.
Just at the same time, in German ordoliberalism, the theory of order is developing, and he's very intrigued by that. And the central point in his theory is the interdependence of orders. So precisely when it comes to transferring insights of economy, legal system, societal system, etc. So it links basically to what Ali said, that you should think in interdependent system. I mean, they don't call it a hierarchy, but it's still a very central point in this theory.
I agree, thank you, yes.
Is it on this?
Thank you, Paul. I mean, this is very interesting. And regarding context, I remember that at one stage, this was an ongoing research since his early days for Hayek on the theory of mind, biology, and all that. But I remember that Joaquin Fuster once presented a paper, and he said that in a way, Hayek rushed off to publish the sensory order because somebody was presenting at the same time a very seminal book on what was going to be the cortex and all that. And I don't know whether that would help to your paper. I forgot the name of the
I think it's
psychologist
Donald
at that
Hebb.
time.
I think Donald Hebb, and it's Hebb who's quoted, to the extent that I've looked at the literature, then it's Hebb who's cited and Hayek isn't. And I think Hayek only begins to receive attention from, somebody mentioned it the other day, I think. There was a symposium organised by, it was you, Scott, but a symposium organised by Walter Weimer at Penn in '77.
Yeah, it comes out in the Palermo-Weimer
Yeah.
anthology.
I think there had been one article before that by Rosemary Agonito in about '75, but after '77, people start getting excited, and Edelman and others, Fuster being another. I won't say they resurrect Hayek's ideas, but they begin to pay him some attention. But I think you're quite right. There was another book at the time. Whether that encouraged Hayek to try and publish it faster, I don't know, I'm afraid.
But he goes after Hebb in the preface. If you go to the preface, he mentions Hebb and he goes after
He mentions him, and he goes after him?
Yes, I did.
Okay, right.
I have it in my
He's
notes.
looking at me again. Eric, why don't you go? He's been very patient.
I learned a lot.
Unusually so.
Well, you're here. What can I say? I've also learned a lot from the paper. I want to offer a helpful suggestion, I think, and one quasi, not really critical, but somewhat critical methodological reflection. The helpful comment is this notion of a true materialism. There is, in fact, a trope that Schlick himself also enjoyed using, and that is to characterize one's own favorite position in terms of the true X and the alternative position as the false X.
Okay.
And part of what that meant was to actually recharacterize, and again, this fits the sensory order thing, what the terms of debate were.
Yeah.
So it was never a pre-existing true versus false X, but it was also always a recasting. And that's a recurring trope, and Schlick is a master at it.
Right.
And so I think the true material, one reason why you're puzzled is there's nothing pre-existing toward the kind of materialism that is about to be endorsed, but it actually is being signaled. I'm here giving you a new definition that's also a true definition of X. So I think that's, once you see that trope, you could kind of anticipate what's happening. The critical comment, and Hayek himself loves doing this in terms of lineages, the true, the true Whigs, skeptics, Hayek himself always does this. There's the true X's and the bad X's, and actually, there are better Hayekians here than me, so I'll stop there. Critical comment is you didn't mention C.D. Broad's Mind in Its Place in Nature, and this is the kind of moment where I feel like you're right to emphasize your dude, but by not mentioning Broad at all, who is mentioned in the sensory order.
He's in the bibliography, yeah.
Yes, and he's actually mentioned in 842. I just checked.
Okay.
Because it's right after the passage you
Okay.
quoted. And Broad's all about emergent properties.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, that's why I'm telling you. You should pay attention. He is,
Sorry,
in fact,
what are
he is in fact the main philosophical emergentist, other than Samuel Alexander. And Alexander gets written out of the history of philosophy, but Broad stays in. So if you're in professional philosophy, you get taught Broad. At least he's mentioned in the syllabus. But the emergent properties are there, complex systems are there.
Okay.
The biological side as an evolutionary story, that's less obviously present in Broad, but he does enough lip services to that's there too. And it's earlier than your guy.
Okay.
And Hayek knows it. So I'm not saying he's the main source. I think you're right to, as the other Hayek scholars are, to focus on a better
Him.
cool dude. But you're in danger of writing out broad out of your history.
Okay.
And that's really, I think, bad methodology, bad history, bad.
Cool. Okay. I'll take a look. Thanks.
Are there other comments, David?
Well, this has been a learning experience for me. And a name that you mentioned that you went through very quickly was J. Woodgear. Is that different?
Joseph Woodger.
Yeah. Is he the translator of Tarski?
No. Woodger, at least not the, oh, no, good God, he might be. Let me explain why.
Because I was always
I think-
puzzled why Tarski's essays were translated by a theoretical biologist.
Then it's Woodger. And I think, so brief potted history. Woodger was, he spent a little bit of time in Cambridge in the 20s, at University College Hospital, developed, he was, along with Bertalanffy, one of the developers of organicist biology. He emphasizes levels of organization. He's also in the footnote that I mentioned to the earlier passage. And his biological principles, published in 1929, I think, is cited in, there's this famous lecture series, seminar series that Hayek holds in 1952 in Chicago. And there isn't much evidence left of what it involved, but there is a syllabus. And one of the things on the syllabus, I think, is Woodger's work. Now, I've got this dim memory of reading articles about Woodger, and he was quite prominent and quite important in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I think he gradually became marginalized, and the reason is he got more and more obsessed with the axiomatization, and this is where I think the link is, of something that's probably theories of biology, but I don't remember. So I'm guessing maybe he was. And the poor chap died in about 1967 and was kind of forgotten at that point, having been really prominent earlier. And I can point you towards some really interesting essays on Woodger if you want to follow it up.
Well, it's just fascinating. I mean, the connection is, that's where model theory goes into English, right?
And he knows German because he translated, I assume Tarski's writing in German.
Both German and Polish.
Well, Woodger translated Bertalanffy's 1926 book, his first book, from German into English. He'd spent time in Vienna, I think, which is where he met Bertalanffy. So he clearly had a very good facility with the German language. So I'm guessing he probably did.
Hopper wrote a glowing obituary. So that might
Really?
Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay, last word.
I'm very glad to meet somebody else who likes 67's article, Notes on the Evolution of the Rules of Conduct.
Cool.
A wonderful scholarship, especially in the light that in the case of Hayek, it's extremely hard to trace the influences. Just recall the Caldwell's discussion with Terence Hutchinson about the influences between Hayek and Popper, and the result was like that nobody influenced, like there was no influence at all. So this is persuasive. We talked about it earlier, and perhaps you'd rather also place his influence, Bertalanffy's influence, into the larger context of influences from natural sciences on Hayek, especially Oxford Zoology. I think it's Eric Angner who wrote about that.
There's a really nice paper on Carl Saunders' influence.
Yeah. On the population things, and it leads later to group selection. And I think
so. I've got a hard copy in my bag, so if you want to find out for sure, we could just open the bag and get it out. Look at the acknowledgement. Ted could do it. In the back zip pocket, pull it out.
Okay. So I think the work is important because it heads to the last problems Hayek faced. It's the group selection things and the problematic things, but I think such scholarship can elucidate it more and trace the true, the best harvest of what the Hayek's late works did. And I think Hayek's what you do for Hayek's earlier works needs to be done also for his late works.
There you are.
Thank you.
Thank
You receive your sealed orders. Thank you.